Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That was the end of our momentary pause. Welcome back after the intermission. This is, if you're still listening for the first time, a part 2 to the Imperial 40k Averages archive video. Please stick with us and remember the chart from last time. We'll be referring to it as we go through the different armors and various materials of the 41st millennium. Without more ado, that's an end to intermission. So, this is a long one, isn't it? And believe me, it's the first of two, so let's get to it. These are general maximum minimum protection of known armor against kinetic and energy weapons. This does not include extremities, including joints or some unarmored areas like eyes or fingers. Inches to millimeters are generally rounded up for your consideration, or rounded down, depending upon the number, or references are used where available. So let's start off with the one that everyone really cares about. I've already analyzed power armor, but let's get really specific now that we have the numbers. The material breakdown. Most of power armor, not including joints and weak spots as mentioned, is between 3 inches and 1 inch of ceramite armor backed with around 10 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent in their metal skin suit or muscle suit, which gives it a protection, on paper of 75 to 25 millimeters of ceramite, backed universally with 10 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. The protection equivalent in rolled homogeneous armor, again, rolled homogeneous armor is 15% stronger than steel, but we're comparing it now to rolled homogeneous armor as that is the basis for what armor is instead of raw steel. The maximum armor is on the shoulders and also on the chest plate. The minimum armor is on things like the thigh and upper arm. For kinetic protection, the maximum protection of power armor is 85 millimeters equivalent of rolled homogeneous armor. And it is 35 millimeters minimum of rolled homogeneous armor against kinetic threats. And energy-wise, it's 160 millimeters of protection, again, jumping dramatically because ceramite has much more resistance against thermal and energy threats than it does against kinetic, and 60 millimeters against, at minimum on the thigh against thermal or against energy weapons. So you can see here, against kinetic damage, it's still very protective. 85 millimeters on the shoulders and chest is significant. 35 millimeters, still good against most infantry weapons, but against heavy weapons, that's going to be a lot of our issues here. But against energy weapons, even at the lowest, 60 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor is quite a bit for most energy weapons to penetrate through, especially for infantry-capable ones. And on the very tough sides, you can kind of forget about it. 160 millimeters of armor is quite a bit for anything other than designate armor-piercing weapons. Eldar Wraithbone armor. Now this includes both the much heavier versions, if you want to just modify the numbers for yourself, and it also includes the lighter ones. So it is generally between 1 and 2 inches of Wraithbone, which is between 50 and 25 millimeters of Wraithbone. So the protection equivalent in RHA, the max is on the shoulder, the minimum is on the upper arm or upper thigh. The kinetic resistance of Wraithbone is between 75 at the max, and of Wraithbone armor is between 75 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at the maximum, 38 millimeters at the minimum. Again, that's just a little bit better at the minimum than power armor against kinetic, but at the maximum, it's still a little bit less than power armor in terms of kinetic resistance. Energy resistance, it's a lot thinner, but it still gives you, for its considerably less weight, 100 millimeters of protection and 50 millimeters of protection. That's significant. It is below power armor just by a little bit for energy protection, but it's still very significant, still going to make you very resistant against a majority of energy threats that you might come up against. But because it is so thin, because it is 50 millimeters and 25 millimeters, it's very light, very mobile, it's not really designed for tanking the heavy anti-infantry fire that power armor is. So, a lot thinner, but still provides you a good deal of protection, especially kinetic protection, but even the energy is not bad whatsoever, and you'll see with more human armor later on how comparable that is. So, steel alloy armor or modified alloy armor. This is, again, the Dark Eldar. I'm taking the best possible version of this. So the lightest, the most effective alloy available to the Dark Eldar. Material breakdown, again, it's between 1 and 2 inches of this alloy. 50 and 25 millimeters. The protection equivalent in RHA, rolled homogeneous armor, again, not steel, 15% stronger than steel, is on the breastplate. That's the maximum. The minimum is the gut plate, or the lower gut of the Dark Eldar armor. It's usually styled up with abdominal muscles, but you could also say the same thing of the arms, for example, or the upper arm. Kinetically, it will resist equivalent to around 60 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at maximum, and then at minimum, 30 millimeters. So you can see inherently it's inferior to Wraithbone armor, but only by a factor of, 15 to 20 millimeters. depending on around 15 or 10 or so millimeters kinetically. But energy-wise, it is dramatically lacking. It is significantly worse. In this case, 40% worse and almost 30% worse in terms of energy protection. So 60 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent to protection for the maximum, and 30% for the minimum, or 30 millimeters for the minimum. So not great, but definitely better than nothing. For Space Marine vehicles, again, this is specifically in relation to the Rhino. The material breakdown is usually 50 millimeters of ceramite and 10 millimeters of steel, again, rolled homogeneous armor. And the alternate, or the areas where there is not ceramite armor, is going to be up-armored to around 30 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. So the protection maximum for that, kinetically, is 60 millimeters, which is not a ton, especially for a lot of kinetic weapons. They'll be able to penetrate the Rhino, but they do need to be decently armor-piercing in order to penetrate 60 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent, and 30 millimeters the lowest. Again, that alternate, assuming that the ceramite were not there, what would we be looking at, saying shooting at it from the top or the bottom, or a weak spot on the side, 30 millimeters of steel. Rolled homogeneous armor. Against energy, however, that protection jumps dramatically because of the ceramite to 210 millimeters of armor protection equivalent, with, again, if we were shooting in an area not covered by ceramite, 30 millimeters of steel. So you can see how a lot of the Space Marine vehicles are tooled for resisting energy weapons more than they are kinetic weapons of a high caliber. And that will be a continued thing onward. On to the bigger slide. Again, same thing. General maximum minimum protection. Known armor against kinetic and energy weapons. Doesn't include extremities, some joints, unarmored areas like eyes and fingers, etc. Heavy carapace up here in this picture. The material breakdown. It is between 1.5 inch of ceramite over all of the armored areas. This includes shoulders, chest, hips, thighs, shins, forearms, gauntlets, all that. So it's between 25 and 13 millimeters of ceramite. All of that is backed by about an inch or 25 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. That does mean that areas like the breastplate and shoulders are going to be 2 inches thick. They're really big. The RHA equivalent flak, armoplas, and synthetic materials, theoretically including the much thicker versions of Tyranid carapace, I make them equivalent to rolled homogeneous armor because even though they behave differently against both kinetic and energy threats, stabbing something like flak armor or shooting it with a bullet are going to have very different effects. Shooting it with an arrow, different effects. Hitting it with energy weapons, on the other hand, it seems to do okay with that, so I've put it as roughly equivalent with some odd quirks at times, so I will treat it as equivalent to rolled homogeneous armor. Protection equivalent to RHA, the maximum is going to be on the shoulders and also the chest. The minimum is going to be on the gauntlets, the shins, that kind of stuff. The kinetic protection is 50 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, so very heavy, very thick protection for a human to be lugging around. And the minimum is going to be 38 millimeters of kinetic protection. And then energy, we see a significant jump. Energy-wise, because it's so thick, heavy carapace can protect you from 75 millimeters worth, equal to 75 millimeters worth of rolled homogeneous armor. And at minimum, energy-wise, it can protect you from 48 millimeter. It can protect you equally to 48 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. Quite a bit. Lots of protection there. Very, very useful. I love heavy carapace. This stuff is wild. It kind of inhibits a little bit of your motion, makes you a little bit slow, but it makes you tanky as hell for a human. Terminator armor. This one's even more crazy here. So, material breakdown, it is 6 to 2 inches of ceramite, 150 to 50 millimeters, and then 10 millimeters of adamantium as a backing. So, again, we're using two special materials here, ceramite and adamantium. The PER, or the protection equivalent to rolled homogeneous armor, so the PER of max is the shoulders, minimum is the upper arm. The kinetic maximum is 170 millimeters of kinetic resistance. That's a ton. That's a ton of protection. That's like tank armor level protection in terms of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent. And then minimum is 70 millimeters. That's going to be something on the upper arm in terms of kinetic protection. Energy-wise, we see a massive jump, though. The maximum energy protection of Terminator's shoulder or breastplate is going to be on par with 320 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. That is a ton of protection, but it makes sense considering how ceramics work, how thermally insulating they are. It's a ton of protection against energy threats, and at bare minimum, because of the adamantium backing and because of how thick the armor is, it's 120 millimeters rolled homogeneous armor equivalent. Very thick, very durable. Custodes armor. This is the only other time that I'll talk about them because I need to talk about them at some point. The material breakdown of their armor is it is the same thickness as regular power armor. So between 3 and 1 inches thick, but instead of being made of ceramite, it's made of auramite. So it is between 75 and 25 millimeters of auramite. All of that is backed by, again, that 10 millimeter mesh of adamantium. The PER, the max is shoulder, and then the minimum is places like the gut plate, thighs, shoulders, that kind of thing. The kinetic resistance of Custodes power armor is 132 millimeters maximum in comparison to rolled homogeneous armor, and minimum protection kinetically is 58 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. So you can see, it's a difference when compared with Terminator armor, but it's much less of a difference than there was for power armor. Energy-wise, on the other hand, it jumps significantly, but again, not as much as Terminator armor does. Energy-wise, it's resistant to 170 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent. So that's the energy resistance at max. The minimum is 70 millimeters. So it just jumps by that solid percentage because they're all more resistant to energy weapons. Moving on to heavy or full flak. These are these kind of paste-on board sections of the armor for the Imperial Guard. Material breakdown, it is between a 1/2 inch and a 1/4 inch of ceramite, backed by 1 or a 1/2 inch of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent flak. So 13 to 7 millimeters of ceramite and 25 to 13 millimeters of RHA flak. PER is the thickest part's the breastplate, the weakest part is the chin, thigh, gauntlet, whatever you want to choose that's lower. It is kinetically resistant to 38 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, and at the least, it is kinetically resistant to 20 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent. Energy-wise, it resists up to 51 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, and at minimum, it's 29 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. Again, I think there's a lot of sway there because the flak is providing a ton of the protection, like with Armaplas or synthetic armor. But those are the numbers for heavy flak or full flak. You could extrapolate that to a lot of different types of flak armor, but at bare minimum, it's probably going to be that 1 inch or 25 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor flak. Rolled homogeneous armor equivalent flak armor. As a little bit of a meme, just to get us going, and I know I've been speaking very, very quickly, but you have to follow along with me and use your eyes. But as a meme, let's do Bane Blades, another super heavy, just for fun. Around 100 millimeters of ceramite and around 100 millimeters of adamantium. So the kinetic resistance of that is going to be 300 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, and the energy resistance is going to be 400 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. So we're getting into very resistant, practically immune to a lot of different weapons, especially energy weapons, but yeah, just wild protection levels there. And you can see here, there are very few things that reach the energy resistance of Terminator armor, but Terminator armor is some of the best protection you can get in the Imperium. So, yeah, very cool, very great. Let's move on to the next important part, and this is kind of an informational part. People who aren't really big into military history, this is just a primer for you for some of the words that I use, because it's going to be important, and we're going to discuss some important 40K-esque concepts here. These are words that are used when describing penetration against armor. So, this is a test or a mental exercise based on different damages that a 10 millimeter mild or hardened steel plate would receive if it were on the human body and being shot by a 9 millimeter bullet or other material or other attacks. So, these are the levels. Minimum damage. Minimal damage would be you take a 10 millimeter plate, you put it on your chest, and then somebody stabs you with a knife. So it's a knife versus a mild steel plate. The result is going to be a scratch. Essentially, metal hits metal, they screech against each other, maybe some sparks, but it's going to leave just a scratch and no real damage to the structure of the metal or to you. Shock and non-penetration. Shock and non-penetration would be something like taking a pickaxe and then hitting that mild steel plate. Now, this is going to do a lot more than a knife, right? It's going to leave that same scratch, that same kind of, pick mark at the very tip of where it struck, but it might also bend the plate. It might deform it a little bit, and that's shock and non-penetration. Essentially, the protection has been hit, and it's deformed, or it's taken some sort of external damage. You can see it here on this AR-500 plate. There's all these bulges and bumps. It has deformed, it has changed its actual shape, but it hasn't gone through. Shock and penetration. So, this is a 9 millimeter bullet versus a hardened steel plate. This is kind of a unique one, but you can see here you can see it here with this Hesh round. Against a hardened steel plate, aka a more brittle but more durable piece of steel, or more difficult to penetrate, there will be a primary dent, which you can see here, this kind of impact mark for shells. And then there will be secondary spalling and tertiary splashback. So the primary dent is essentially the bullet or the impact spends all of its energy, it sprays out in an area, it causes that dent, that deformation, but then it also sprays a bunch of lead outward from the impact, maybe shooting into your neck if this plate was on your face, or going into your hands or your weapon or something like that. It will have shrapnel on the front side as the munition essentially expands or explodes or breaks upon the protection, doing that dent, but it will also have spalling. So apart from the splashback, apart from the lead spraying off of the plate, you will have spalling, especially on hardened steel. And you can see that here with the Hesh round. Essentially, kinetic damage or kinetic impact is radiated through the steel at incredible speeds, and the density or the brittleness of the material causes shreds or shards of spalling or of material to break off of the back of the plate and spray around inside of the tank or on the back of the armor. So if you were wearing this and you had a shock and penetration hit, where it hit, didn't penetrate, didn't go through, so shock and penetration, it didn't go through, but it did a dent, it sprayed a bunch of bullet pieces on the outside of the armor, and then it shot a bunch of pieces of metal into you as spalling. Then the next one is penetration. Now this is the important one. 9mm bullet versus a mild steel plate. That means, penetration means that it goes through the target. There will be a hole, like here, or like here, or here. There will be a hole where the object, the bullet, the munition goes through the armor protection. However, there's some important things that you need to note here. The first two are bullet wobble and bullet deformation and sticking in the plate. So, bullet wobble is something that happens in the air if a bullet is not stabilized, if it's not accurate, if it's spinning, if it's twisting. If you're using something that isn't like ballistically stable, it can begin to twist, it can begin to move so that it hits the target sideways. But even when something goes through a target, for example, if you look at the tank armor here, you can see some hits spray upward or they spall upwards, and almost all of them jerk material upward. Why is that? Essentially, the kinetic impact of the penetration is pushing material upward, and it's creating a harder and harder incline at which the object has to go, but even if it does penetrate, it might penetrate at an angle, or it might squish a little bit as it goes through. So, bullet wobble is the first part, where it's changing direction or kind of dynamics once it hits or before it hits the target. The second one is deformation. Deformation means that when a bullet or something else hits armor protection, it flattens and it twists. Even if it penetrates, it will not be penetrating in perfect condition. It will essentially be squished and flattened and damaged, and it won't be ballistically stable and want to just kind of be spinning around, flying at whatever speed it gets through it at. The last one is if it doesn't even get all the way through, you have something called sticking in the plate. Sticking in the plate will effectively be like these shells that you can see here. They've gone into the protection, the tip of the shell is probably penetrating through the armor, but it hasn't gone all the way through. It hasn't managed to escape the plate, essentially. Which means, yes, you have technically penetrated, but the actual after effect damage is going to have to be done by other means. Now, let's talk about those other means. You have splinters, spall, and post-pen. Splinters are when you have a shell that gets through or gets partially through and then sprays parts of itself, so it either explodes or it breaks apart and sprays bits of the bullet casing, lead, anything like that, inside of the target past the plate that it's penetrated. Spall is like the spalling that we talked about before. It's pieces of the actual protection that are shivered or broken off and spray around inside of the vehicle or inside of your body if you're wearing body armor. And the last one is post-pen effects. Now, there are lots of post-pen effects, and I could go into them in a lot of detail, but really it's just something explodes inside of the armor. Essentially, the shell detonates or the bullet expends gas or poison or whatever it is because it's penetrated, because it's gotten through the armor and to the squishy things inside that it was trying to kill. It can now do its post-pen effects if it has them. You know, some bullets are just solid steel or tool steel or lead or tungsten carbide. That's not going to do anything if it sticks in the plate. It's just going to spray a bunch of spalling everywhere. But if you have a bullet that's filled with sarin gas, if you have one that's filled with tear gas, or if they were filled with mustard gas or poison, or if they were explosive like a shell, that could have a post-pen effect even if it gets stuck in the plate. Perforation. This is the next step. 9mm armor-piercing bullet versus a mild steel plate. This is a full penetration with a full secondary effect, aka nothing does more than slow down the projectile. So this would be firing against armor that you can absolutely penetrate without much difficulty. For example, I would say that a guardsman in standard flak armor, not heavy flak or anything, gets shot in the chest with a bolt round. It's going to go right through, maybe get a little resistance, but it's not going to fail to penetrate. It's going to go right in and explode. That means you achieve full penetration, there's no real slowing or deformation, or there's minimal slowing or deformation of the bullet, and it manages to do its full secondary effect the way that you would like it to. And then finally is a through and through. Through and through would be a 7.92 or a large machine gun or rifle caliber armor-piercing round versus 2 hardened steel plates. Now, this essentially means that you will penetrate, you'll get a full perforation, or full penetration, so a full perforation. It will penetrate right through, it will deform, but it will continue with enough velocity to hit again. And now, an example with personal body armor would be, you shoot somebody in the chest, it goes through their chest protection, through their body cavity, and then out the back, and penetrates their rear protection as well, and maybe hits another dude behind them. That's how through and through works. So, the matrix of steps in armor penetration, or solving the will and or how much will X penetrate Y. Now, I often put this down to a simple question that, I've been asked before, and I ask other people to try and do a litmus test of what they know about armor protection. I call it the angry Ogren swinging a pickaxe at power armor question, or the in a single shot issue. So, the question goes, how much will a rifle bullet penetrate flak armor? Well, you would go through it like this. Does it have enough velocity? Yes. Does it have enough mass? Yes. Is the armor X thickness or Y thickness? Can it penetrate X or Y thickness? Once you determine that, you can determine what it is. If it's close, if it's within range, or if there's some range contention, you go down the list. Is it going to do minimal damage? Is the armor protective enough that it won't really do anything other than scratch it up? Is it going to do shock and non-penetration? Is it going to hit the armor and just kind of bounce off, maybe deform it a little bit through sheer kinetic energy, but probably not penetrate? Is it going to shock and penetration? Is it moving fast enough, quickly enough, that spalling, splashback, or spray, in addition to deformation, will be important with the weapon? And penetration. Will it go through and maybe get stuck? And then full perforation. Through and throughs you don't usually have to worry about with the matrix system unless you're firing at multiple targets, but perforation is kind of the end step where you can be like, if it will perforate, you can say guarantee if it hits, it'll pen. So I just use the angry Ogren swinging a pickaxe at power armor question because people who don't understand armor penetration will say either shock and non-penetration or minimal damage. People who do understand armor penetration and know that the strength of an Ogren, the particular impact of the pickaxe, all the different things will matter, well, they'll go into the next question. Where are you hitting him? Are you hitting him in the arm? Are you hitting him in the face, stomach, leg? Is it a weak spot? Or are you going for the base part of his armor? And that's why I made this video, because now you guys can go back when someone asks you, will blank penetrate blank? Will X penetrate Y? In what situation will you be able to do this? You can go back to my power armor thing and say, well, here's the minimum, here's there, this is the underlayer. At bare minimum, it has to penetrate 10 millimeters of steel. So a pistol bullet would probably need to hit it a few times, or anything like that. And the other thing is, this assumes, as we mostly do, it's just a single shot. We can hit the same target multiple times. We have fully automatic weapons, not to mention the ability to hit the same target multiple times using, I don't know, some darn precision or some bigger rounds. So it is always an assumption with people that you can't just fire again at the same spot. Again, at range with standard firearms, that's hard. But like I said, one of my standard tactics would be stab an opponent and pull the trigger until they're dead. So you need to assume that it's not going to just be a single shot. So there are full auto weapons, against certain armor. So let's say that shooting against the vambrace or the front guard of a Space Marine's arm, you have a pistol right up to it, like a 50 AE Desert Eagle, and you just kind of pop it once. It's probably going to make a little dent, maybe some dust, not much else. Pop it again. might do a deeper dent, might dig out a little bit, spray some lead everywhere. Again, 3, 4 times, you're going to start to see cracks, breaking, shattering. You're going to see sections starting to flake away, revealing under armor, and then you've compromised the armor, at which point you can get through with multiple shots. And again, that's just in a controlled setting. On the battlefield, this applies when dozens of different people are firing at the same exact target. So this is why I often say that something like volley fire against medium armored enemies is a great idea, because you're going to hit weak spots. You're going to go for areas that they aren't necessarily as well protected, not to mention, apart from getting lucky, hitting the same place twice, compromising the armor is a very easy way to make them no longer as protected as they, on paper, should be. So never assume it's just a single shot. And something doesn't have to be able to penetrate in a single shot to be able to penetrate. Important thing. I will eventually do a video for all the different armor-piercing effects of all different weapons in 40k, but that's going to be a very long process like this one was. Materials of Imperial construction. Let's go on to some more fun stuff, just some quick stuff that I like talking about. Rockcrete. This is concrete with rocks in it. It's used for roads, filler, small and medium buildings. It's not usually all that portable. It's usually pretty heavy. You kind of pour it out and let it set. It's not pretty, but it is cheap. It's incredibly cheap, and it's able to be made pretty easily locally, and it's usually not reinforced with all that much steel. So that'd be an example of this kind of pebblecrete. Permacrete. This is the one that you hear about all the time. What is it? It is steel-reinforced concrete, usually in prefabricated structures. So hive structures, large buildings, all that stuff like that. It is concrete. Again, it's aggregate plus very fine gravel plus sand, all put together with essentially chemical adhesive, limestone, that kind of stuff, and it will form a solid block of stone, quote-unquote. And the perma part of it, the permacrete part, is the fact that it has a bunch of steel reinforcement in it. It's not doped with steel, but it is steel reinforced with like big old beams and steel kind of rods like these ones. Usually they're about 10 millimeters thick. Ferrocrete. This is one that we don't hear a lot about, but I actually really like it a lot because it kind of has an equivalent in our own world. It is a steel-doped and heavily steel-reinforced, almost like steel fiber-reinforced permacrete. So it is often steel-coated or sheathed concrete, so it will actually have a steel covering over it. But even without that, this is something that has like iron in it, and it's heavily reinforced with steel. It's very tough, it's very durable, it's hard to break. And unlike permacrete, it doesn't tend to collapse under its own weight as easily. And of course, unlike rockcrete, it's pretty easy to move around, even though it's very heavy. You know, rockcrete would just shatter and break apart because it's very weak. But this steel-doped and heavily reinforced material is often literally sheathed in steel, and because it has so much metal in it, you could also theoretically take this and treat it like armor and kind of face harden it, or put steel plates over it, so that you could make things like the walls on heavy fortresses and hive walls. And an interesting little note, if you ever see a hive wall rusting or a fortress wall with rust on it, seemingly like rusting concrete, that's going to be ferrocrete. And it's a really, really cool thing. I like that idea of differentiating what we make things out of. You know, rockcrete is going to be like roads, maybe some small buildings, some basic stuff that's kind of like made on job site things. Permacrete is going to be a vast majority of stuff, and then ferrocrete is what we use when we want something even more durable and fortressy than permacrete. All of these are very heavy. So, please note, disclaimer, these are variable. All the stuff above is personal numbers. They do not have to be your numbers. Please do not crucify me. I'm doing my best here to create a baseline from which I will do more videos. The cycle begins anew with a new vote up. I'm sure this will spark a lively debate. So there may be a part 2 to this part 2, or vigorous commenting may be required. Maybe I'll go over it in more detail in another video. Maybe I'll do a corrections video. Probably not. I think I did pretty okay here, especially with the disclaimer that, you know, most of these are variable. I'm doing my best here. And also, I might do a penetration table for all 40k weapons. That might be a long process, because, of course, we have to go into physical weapons that aren't in all the stuff, but I'll do my best with that. And I will also be streaming later tonight, and I will give you all an opportunity to go and yell at me about that. But for the moment, I wish you all a lovely good night. I didn't say it at the end of the last video because it was a part 1, and I hope you listened all the way to the end. So I hope you enjoyed, and I wish you all a lovely good night.